Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to test out the latest AYANEO handheld PC. This one is called the AYANEO Slide. Now at first glance, this is pretty similar to other handheld PCs we've seen from this company with one major exception. And that is, it's the first one they've created that has a slide out screen with a keyboard underneath. And considering this is a Windows-based handheld, that can come in pretty handy when you're trying to navigate the operating system. And so in this video, we're going to do a deep dive review and figure out whether or not that additional keyboard is going to make it a worthy contender within their own lineup. And of course, we'll see how it stacks up against the competition with a similar form factor. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, to start, let's talk about pricing. So this is up for pre-order on Indiegogo right now, and the starting price for the base model, which has 16GB of RAM and 512GB of storage, is about $700. Now bear in mind that's an early bird price, which means it's going to go up to $800 here in the future, but even then that's a similar price point to what you would find with something like the ROG Ally or the Lenovo Legion Go. And of course, if you don't mind paying for it, there are some upgrades, including 32 or 64 gigs of RAM and all the way up to 4TB of storage. And of note, the review unit I'll be using in my testing has 32GB of RAM. So let's look a little bit deeper into the specs, starting with the CPU. So this is running a Ryzen 7 7840U. This has been on the market for nearly a year at this point, and we've seen it in all the top-end handhelds. And so the performance now is pretty well known. It's got 8 cores, 16 threads, and it has an internal graphics card, the Radeon 780M. The AYANEO Slide also has LPDDR5X RAM, and it's currently clocked at 6400 MHz. However, they do plan on unlocking it to 7500 MHz once they've stabilized the firmware. And like I mentioned, they are offering a range between 16 and 64GB of RAM. Same thing with storage, we have quite a few options all the way from 512GB up to 4TB, and all the storage will be M.2 2280. When it comes to the display, we've got a pretty standard IPS LCD panel, 6 inches and a 1080p resolution. And we've got a pretty big battery considering the size of this handheld, 46.2 watt-hours with a max TDP of 28 watts. And of course, we'll do thorough battery testing later in the video. Now in terms of connectivity, this has the works, so Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.2, and it also has 2 full-speed USB 4 ports, and like I mentioned before, that slide-up screen which will expose the keyboard. So that's really about it when it comes to the specs. Let's go ahead and take a look at the unboxing. And this is actually pretty clever. They have a VHS-style box, and as I always like to do during my unboxings, I want to make a note here that this was sent over to me for review, but as always, all opinions are my own and no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not seeing this video ahead of time. Anyway, inside you'll get a couple manuals that'll talk you through both the software and the hardware, and I think that unlike some of their other devices, they've struck a pretty good balance here between sleek and impressive while not being wasteful. Anyway, digging further inside, we've got 3 different AC adapters. All 3 of these are for Antarctica. That's pretty awesome. We've also got a couple USB adapters, and then of course our USB cable for charging. And then to round it all out, we've got a 65-watt wall plug. So let's move on and talk about the device itself with my first impressions. Now, first thing, when I picked it up, this thing is impressively hefty. Not only is it quite thick, but it's also very dense feeling, like there is no wasted space within this thing at all. And so in that regard, it does feel like a very high quality piece of machinery. Now, the next thing I wanted to check is the feel of the plastic, especially because it's a black device. And it does have a sleek, kind of powdery finish to the plastic, but it does feel like it's going to pick up on my fingerprints over time. And sure enough, here's a look at it after 3 days of testing, and you can see it is smudging everywhere. Now, they offer both black and white options, so if I were you and you don't like to see these kind of smudges, I would recommend the white model. Now, the next thing that I noticed are the ergonomic grips here on the back. We'll test these more later when we talk about ergonomics. And then, of course, who could forget about this slide-up screen? And I've got a whole section where we'll talk about this and compare it to others, but first impressions here, it is pretty strong. And by that, I mean that when you try to push it open, you only have to get maybe 30% of the way there, and then it takes care of the rest for you. And so, of course, we'll talk about the screen and the hinge here in a moment. But before that, I want to talk about the controls, because there are some unique things with this device. We'll start with one that hasn't changed at all, and that's going to be the analog sticks. These are essentially the same size that you would find on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, and it feels like they're the exact same Hall sensor sticks that we've found on the AYANEO Air devices. And so if you've ever played on a Nintendo Switch, you're going to be pretty familiar with this feel. Next up, let's talk about the D-pad, because this does seem unique from the other AYANEO devices. Number one, it has a rubber membrane connection, which means it has a more squishy kind of classic D-pad feel, but one thing I noticed right off the bat is that it's a little bit easier to press down on than before. Not only that, it seems to lack a little pivot in the center. And what that means is when you press on any one direction, it feels like the whole D-pad is going down as opposed to having it centered in the middle. And this was an issue that we found on a lot of the really old AYANEO devices like the AYANEO Next that they seem to have fixed over time. So for me, it is a little bit weird that we're seeing a non-pivot D-pad again. And of course, the best way to actually test a D-pad is to try out a couple specific games. We're going to start with Street Fighter 2 Turbo here on the Super Nintendo first. And right off the bat, I'm finding that it's very easy to press a diagonal when I'm trying to do a move like a Hadouken or a Shoryuken. So if anything, if you're trying to play a game that requires to hit a lot of diagonals, like a Street Fighter fighting game, then yes, this seems to work okay. However, even in this initial testing, I can tell that it's a little bit too easy to actually press this diagonal. It's a little bit more than I would like. And so, of course, the next test is going to be whether or not it can avoid accidental diagonals. And my favorite game to test with this is going to be Contra on the NES. And what I like to do here is press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right, and see whether or not the character moves. And as you can see, the character is moving all over the place. That means that accidental diagonals are going to be pretty common on this device. Now, I'm no D-pad engineer, but in my opinion, it looks like it's lacking that pivot in the center. And so, as a result, when you try to rock it back and forth, you're also going to tap those diagonals at the same time. So unfortunately, I would say that if you're trying to play a very precision-based game on the D-pad specifically, you may not have a good time. So for example, when I'm trying to play a really precise platformer like Celeste or even a Mario game, I don't think I would really enjoy this. So I think if I had to grade this, I would give it maybe a 6 out of 10. I think it'll work fine with modern games, you know, when you need to change out a weapon or whatever, but if you're trying to play a retro or more precision-based game, it's probably not going to be great. And then finally, on the bottom of the left side, we have our select and start buttons. Okay, next up I want to talk about their face buttons, which do seem to be a little bit different than their other devices. Number one, these are also using a rubber membrane connection, but right off the bat I can tell that they're a little bit bigger than they would usually be on a small device like this. Now in terms of travel and play, it actually feels really good, and so I got no complaints about actually using the buttons, but I did want to measure them just to make sure I wasn't taking crazy pills. So here they are, they're a little bit under 8mm, and I usually consider 8mm to be a good standard when it comes to a retro handheld. If we take a look at the AYANEO Air, which is another device made by them, you can see it's only about 7mm, and so you can see it is a little bit bigger on the new AYANEO Slide. However, that being said, it's not the biggest button they've made. For example, the AYANEO Kun has about a 9mm button, so it's somewhere in the middle right there. Either way, I like the fact that they increased the size of these buttons on such a smaller device. It does feel really good. However, one thing I did notice in my testing is the position of the right analog stick, which is pretty common in AYANEO devices. As you can see in this footage, the right analog stick is placed directly below the face buttons. And in truth, with a small device like this, there's not a lot of room to work with, but all the same, when trying to play a game where you're pressing more than one face button at once, especially when it comes to something like Super Mario World, where you're holding onto the run button and then jumping, that right analog stick can really get in the way of your thumb. Now for me personally, it's something that I usually will just get used to as I'm playing, and you can also pull the analog stick cap right off if you just don't want it in your way. And so there are ways to get around it, but all the same, it is something that I observed when I was playing. And then finally, on our right side, we have two AYANEO function buttons. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about the keyboard that we have beneath the screen. The keys themselves are LED backlit, but there's nothing to differentiate them from the rest of the case. So for example, they are flush with the case, and also there are no bumps on any of the keys to indicate if you're on the home row or things like that. Now, when it comes to typing on this, I think the most logical way to use it is with your thumbs. So if you think about one of those old Sidekick cell phones from back in the day, I think it's going to be a similar experience to that. However, one thing to bear in mind is this device is a lot wider than those old cell phones. And a lot of that has to do with the controls on each side of the keyboard. And so as a result, when it comes to actually typing with your thumbs, it can be pretty awkward to hold the device and type at the same time. In fact, reaching those center keys is quite a stretch for me and my medium-sized hands. So the way I see it, much like with other handhelds with the same form factor, is I think it's going to work great when you're trying to type in a username and password, and I certainly think it's going to be more convenient than trying to use a touch keyboard on a 6-inch screen, but I think that's about the extent of where I would want to use this when it comes to typing. So for example, when it comes to like taking down notes or things along those lines, I don't think I would want to do it. Okay, now let's take a look at the bottom of the device. On each end, we have our two stereo speakers, and then in the center we have one of our USB 4 connections, and then a micro SD card slot, as well as a small hole for the inbuilt microphone. And let's go ahead and do a quick audio test while we're here. And I would say the audio quality here is pretty standard for an AYANEO handheld in that it is fairly muffled, but all the same it is quite loud. And there are third-party options like FX Sound which can improve the audio quality, so that's usually what I would do. Okay, looking at the back here, we don't have a lot going on other than the AYANEO logo and then our fan intake on the left. So let's go ahead and jump into the top section, starting with our triggers and shoulders. And right off the bat, I'm a big fan of these new triggers. I think they have a good amount of travel to them, so you can definitely feel the full range of the analog input without it feeling too much like a full paddle. And so I think they did a pretty good job right here finding that correct distance, and yeah, it feels really good. And by the way, these are also Hall-based sensored triggers, and so they feel nice and smooth. The shoulder buttons also feel pretty good. They have a little bit of a mushy feel to them, but they're easy to press down on, which is always something that I enjoy. So overall, I'm a fan of both the shoulders and the triggers. Also on the inside, we have two programmable function buttons like we've seen with other AYANEO devices. And then also up top, we have our USB 4 port, an LED light, and then another microphone input, followed by our volume buttons, and then a power button, which is also a fingerprint sensor. So next I want to talk about the feel of the device and the size of it, as well as the screen. And like I mentioned, it has a very solid heft to it, so it's really impressive when you first pick it up. And it is quite a novelty to be able to flip up your screen when you need to expose that keyboard. It's pretty cool. And of course, having that slide up screen does present some other options we'll talk about later, like the fact that you can actually flip this up about 30 degrees as well. But as it stands from an ergonomic standpoint, when you're actually just holding the device against the bumpers in the back, it really is a comfortable handheld to hold. I think part of that has to do with the fact that it is a little bit thicker, so it feels more solid in the hand, but I also think they've improved the ergonomics on these back bumpers. Even though the device is roughly the size of an AYANEO Air, I don't know why, but it just feels a lot more comfortable to hold in the hand. And I think it's because the mold is a little bit straighter up and down. It's very similar to like a Steam Deck, but much smaller. And so when it comes to holding and playing this device, it's one of my favorites from AYANEO. It's surprisingly comfortable for being so small. And to give you an idea of just how small it is, let's do a quick size comparison against some others on the market. We'll start with other AYANEO devices first. So this here is the AYANEO Air 1S. And as you can see, they are a pretty similar size, although the Air S is quite a bit smaller when it comes to weight and thickness. And also the screen is smaller. This is only 5.5 inches compared to the 6 on the AYANEO Slide. Moving up next in size is going to be the AYANEO 2S. Now this one has a 7-inch screen and also is a 16:10 aspect ratio, which makes it taller. But as you can also see, the AYANEO 2S is quite a bit bigger overall as well. And when you look at them side by side, you can see just how compact the AYANEO Slide is altogether. Speaking of compact, let's move over to other competitor devices, and I think the most direct competitor is going to be the GPD Win 4. This one also has a slide-up screen and is very compact. As you can see, it's actually a little bit smaller than the AYANEO Slide. And of note, these do have the exact same screen size, so 6 inches 1080p. Up next, we have the AYANEO Max. This one has an older processor inside, it's the 6800U, but I wanted to compare these two because the AYANEO Slide is actually smaller, but they do have the same size screen at 6 inches. Another 6-inch device made by AYN is the new Odin 2. Now this one's an Android-based device, so it's not a handheld PC, but I did want to give a relative size comparison between the two in case you're in the market for one or the other. Now let's move on to the bigger devices. So next up we have the Asus ROG Ally, and this one has a larger 7-inch display but is quite a bit bigger than the Slide as well. Same thing with the Steam Deck OLED, which has a 7-inch 16:10 aspect ratio screen, and of course the Steam Deck design is definitely more tailored towards being comfortable as opposed to being compact. And of course, just to go all the way, let's test it out against the Lenovo Legion Go, and then finally the largest of the AYANEO devices, the AYANEO Kun. Now, another thing I mentioned about the AYANEO Slide is just how hefty it feels. And as you can see here, it's about 650 grams in terms of weight. And so let's compare that against other devices, starting with the lightest ones and working our way up. We'll start with the Odin 2, which is 412 grams, so much lighter. And same thing with the AYANEO Air at 451 grams compared to the 650 from the Slide. And there are quite a few other devices that are still lighter than the AYANEO Slide, including the AYANEO Max and the GPD Win 4, which is a very dense device on its own. And believe it or not, the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck OLED are still lighter. In fact, to find a device that's at least as heavy or heavier than the AYANEO Slide, we have to go pretty big, including the AYANEO 2. And then of course everything after that is going to be much heavier, like the AYANEO Kun. So really in the past couple weeks of my testing with the AYANEO Slide, I came to a couple conclusions about its size and weight. And I think the most important among them is that it does feel impressively compact. It's not so small that I would be comfortable pocketing it, especially because it's so heavy, but I really do just kind of love picking it up and holding it because it is so big and it gets a little bit bigger when you slide up that screen as well. And so if anything, if you don't like heavy devices, it's probably not going to be a good match for you. too. But if you don't mind having a device that's a little bit on the heavy side, it's a really impressive thing to pick up and play. And so over the past couple weeks, I just kind of got used to the heft of it to the point where I still really enjoyed it, and I didn't find it to be too heavy. So next I want to dive a little bit deeper into the screen and the keyboard and how they all kind of work together. And one of the things they really kind of tout about this device is the fact that it has this floating style screen. And when it comes to playing the device with the screen slid down like in its normal form, it is really solid feeling. And not only that, because the screen is separated from the rest of the device, it stays nice and cool no matter what. And that's been nice because screens on other handhelds will emit a lot of heat, and this one does not at all. In fact, it's probably the coolest screen I've ever seen on a device so far. And like I mentioned earlier, when you slide up the screen, you have the ability to actually bend it towards you about 30 degrees. And believe it or not, having even just 30 degrees of latitude here to be able to adjust the viewing angle can make a big difference. However, I do think the implementation on this just feels a little bit rickety for my tastes. Number one, when you slide up the screen, you can see these springs that actually hold it in place, and that does make me a little bit worried to have exposed springs like this. Are they going to get dusty over time? I'm not really sure. Either way, it feels a little bit like peeking behind the curtain in Wizard of Oz. It's something I'd rather not see. Not only that, the other factor you have to think about is that because the screen can move back and forth, it might do that when you don't want it to either. And so as you can imagine, when you slide up the screen and play like that, either at a 0 or 30-degree angle, you can definitely feel that it's not quite as sturdy as it was when it was pushed down and retracted. For example, if you were to be playing this device and you were shaking it as you were playing it, or maybe you were on like a bumpy road, you'll find that the screen wobbles quite a bit. It's not to the point where I feel like it's going to break off, but all the same, this is definitely not a device I'd be comfortable with giving to a child to play. Now that being said, I think that this is a device made for adults, and I think adults can take care of their own stuff, but all the same, among all the other AYANEO devices I've tested before, this is the one that probably needs the most babying. So if you are planning on using this in a more rugged fashion, I would say the AYANEO slide is probably not going to be a great fit. Now when it comes to sliding screens, I don't know a lot when it comes to engineering this kind of part, but like I mentioned earlier, the screen is spring loaded, so you don't have to push it up all the way. In fact, you only have to push it about 30% of the way, and then it takes care of the rest. And like I mentioned, you can see these springs on the back here as you push it up and down. And while I think it's a pretty cool mechanic to not have to push it up all the way, it does worry me because the springs feel so strong that maybe at some point it will actually snap the screen. And I think the best way to capture this issue is to compare it against the GPD Win 4. This one also has a slide-up screen, but the design is quite a bit different. Number one, it doesn't have that whole floating screen mechanism. It's actually really flush with the rest of the device. And so the screen is embedded within a track in the device. And so even then, it's not spring-loaded, at least not to the point where when you push it up, it's not going to be pushing up on its own. Instead, it feels more like a true slide function, where you slide it up and then slide it back down. And because we're not relying on springs to push us the rest of the way there, I can be as gentle as I would like as I move it up. And unfortunately, the AYANEO slide does not give us that luxury. Once you start pushing it up, it's just going to slam all the way to the top. And I think it's a bummer because the GPD Win 4 feels very solid even when you have the screen slid all the way up, and I would love to see that in the AYANEO slide as well. Let me give you a quick sound test so you can see the difference between the two. So yeah, if anything, I would say the AYANEO slides mechanism just feels a lot more violent and more abrupt than I would like. Anyway, in terms of other factors, I think they're pretty similar. As you can see, they're about the same thickness. And even though the GPD Win 4 is not quite as wide altogether, I think they still feel exceptionally compact. And for me personally, I like a handheld that feels really compact. In fact, it reminds me of the original PS Vita. If you ever played the PS Vita 1000 model, then you know that the moment you pick it up, it just feels really solid and sturdy, and as a result, it feels very expensive and sleek. And I think that both the GPD Win 4 and the AYANEO slide do that really well. Now, when it comes to the comfort of playing these two devices, I found that the AYANEO slide was actually quite a bit more comfortable than the GPD Win 4. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that I could angle the screen to that at 30 degrees, and that made it a lot more comfortable to use. And it's really a small difference, but at the same time, when you're actually playing it, it's pretty awesome. If anything, it has a bit more of a clamshell type of feel to it, in the fact that you can adjust the angle to you as opposed to moving your hands to meet the angle. And so I think when it comes to my overall comfort in holding my hands and angling my wrists and even the viewing angle, I think the AYANEO Slide has something really good going on. And so with all that out of the way, let's move out of the hardware space and move into the software. And we'll start with the IA Space software, which is the 2.0 version, which has been available for a couple devices at this point. And they've got a few things going on here. Number one is a game launcher, so as you install games from GOG or Steam or Epic, they'll all show up here. And so if you'd like, you can just kind of stay within the IA Space ecosystem to launch your games. Now, I've gone over this before, but within the IA Space software, you do have quite a few settings options too. For example, within the performance section, you can change different settings for different power profiles. And within here, you can adjust things like the TDP power profile or the fan speed, and you can even toggle on CPU turbo if you'd like. And you've got a bunch of different profiles to choose from, and you can customize them as well, so you've got a lot of options to work with. Another section they've been working on recently is called the Motion EX, and this essentially is their gyroscopic function within the software. And there are quite a few options here. You can adjust the sensitivity of both axes, and you can also invert them and then also set a trigger button. So for example, if you want to apply gyroscopic controls to your right analog stick controls, you can do that, and then also set a button to trigger that initially. So theoretically, if you hold onto the left trigger button and then start moving the device around, it'll function as your right analog stick. And this is very similar to the gyro controls that have been recently added to the ROG Ally. However, it's unfortunate, but in my testing, I couldn't actually get this to work. But also bear in mind that this is early software, and so it might be working on retail units, or it might be something they're still implementing. But all the same, I did want to note that they are at least putting in the building blocks, and I'm assuming this will be a feature sometime in the future. However, as it stands right now, I wasn't able to properly test this. Now, a couple other elements within IA Space worth noting is a performance monitor. So if you'd like, you can turn this on and have a performance overlay to be able to see your frames per second or how much of the CPU is being used. And you've got a couple different options within here. Now, for my own testing, I use something else just so I can have more granular data, but I think if you just want to have something easy to see your stats without having to go into the details, this is pretty good. Now, another section worth checking out is the controller settings. Within here, you can adjust things like your joystick sensitivity as well as the vibration strength. And then also further down, you can adjust the RGB lighting, both around the analog sticks and the keyboard itself. And that's something I've always liked about AYANEO, is that they always have RGB lighting in their devices, and you can always customize it as well. So if you don't like it, you can turn it off, but if you do, you've got quite a few options. And then finally, the last thing I like to mention about IA Space is that it also has a quick access menu. You can press that with one of those AYANEO buttons on the bottom right, and within the quick menu, you can do many of the other settings changes we just went over, but in a much more convenient manner. And so for me personally, I usually will go into the settings once and set up all my different profiles, and from then on, I will use the quick menu to be able to access those and switch between them as I need. And so I do think it takes a little bit of time to get used to the IA Space ecosystem, but I think they've done a pretty good job here in trying to override some of those clunky Windows options. It's definitely not perfect and not comparable to something like SteamOS, but all the same, I think they're getting there day by day. Okay, I think we've set the stage when it comes to the software experience. Now let's move on to game performance. As always, I want to start with PC games, and we're going to start with the lightweight titles and work our way up. And there's a couple things I want to do here. Number one, I'm going to try to use 1080p as my default resolution, and I also want to pay attention to the power profile to see how much battery life is going to be used as we start to play these games. And of course, we'll do a full battery test at the end of the video. Either way, when it comes to lightweight games, I found that anywhere between 5 and 8 watts seems to be the sweet spot, and I think that's pretty typical of this CPU as well as other devices on the market. And of course, from a performance standpoint, you're going to have no problem playing these games whatsoever. Now, as we start to move up to the more middleweight games, you can see that you have to increase the TDP to be able to get a full frame rate. For example, with Hades, it requires about a 12 watt TDP. However, one thing to make note of is that once I hit about 15 watt TDP, I could definitely feel the device getting quite warm. And I've also found that around the 15 watt TDP power profile is about where the 7840U really shines. By that I mean that it gets a really good balance between battery efficiency as well as the performance on the games that you're playing. And so for the most part, that's the standard that I tested with a lot of PC games, about 15 watt TDP. And even at that 15 watt TDP, the performance here has always been impressive on the 7840U. For example, with Horizon Zero Dawn at 1080p low settings with FSR set to ultra quality, we're getting a pretty good lock at 40 frames per second. And I think with this 6-inch screen, the 1080p with FSR turned on actually still looks looks really good. And it's a pretty similar story with Elden Ring. We can do 1080p low settings at a 15W TDP, but I will say that this one does dip below 30 frames per second when in combat from time to time. So not quite an ideal experience. In fact, I think this Steam Deck runs a little bit better than this, so it may be one that you would have to drop down to 720p to get better frame rate. Another example worth talking about is going to be Destiny 2. And for this one, I found that to get a good frame rate between like 50 and 60 frames per second, I did have to drop it down to 720p low settings. And I did find it's a little bit blurry compared to 1080p, but still definitely playable. However, one thing I did note in my testing when playing first-person shooter games, I could definitely feel the age of those Switch-style Joy-Con analog sticks. And that's not to say that the sticks themselves are bad. After all, I think they're pretty good for what they do, but I think we found better sticks coming out around the same size. In fact, I would prefer using the sticks on the Odin 2 more than these, and same thing with the GPD Win 4. When it comes down to it, when playing a first-person shooter game on small Switch-style sticks, it just feels a lot more like flicking than actually moving. So if anything, I would say that Destiny 2 still feels like it's playable on this device, but it also feels like a compromise, and I couldn't really shake that feeling during my testing. And so I would say when it comes to first-person shooters, there are much better handhelds out there, including the ROG Ally, the Steam Deck, and even the GPD Win 4. And also, like I mentioned, around 15 watts seems to be the ideal TDP for me. It does make the device quite a bit warmer, but not to the point where it's uncomfortable. However, I did find that anything beyond that, even up to 18 watts, it just made it feel a little bit more on the hot side. And so while this device can go all the way up to a 28 watt TDP, I found that in my testing, I didn't really want to. I found that 15 watts was about as far as I could make it. And of course, another thing to note is that as you increase that wattage, it's going to decrease the battery life. And also bear in mind that as you increase the wattage, it's not going to be a huge leap in performance for many games. For example, with Marvel's Spider-Man at a 15 watt TDP, I got an average of about 35 frames per second. It would kind of go back and forth quite a bit, but this is definitely a game you could lock at 30 frames per second and have a really stable experience. Meanwhile, if I push it all the way up to 28 watt TDP, you won't see a huge increase in performance. Instead, you're going to see an average frame rate of around 40 frames per second, so not a big leap at all, especially considering the fact that we're basically pushing twice as much power into the CPU at this point. And finally, another note worth mentioning when it came to PC gaming in particular were that there were some control issues I had with this device. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it has both a keyboard and a controller attached at the same time. And there are some games that don't know what to do when you have that type of control scheme set up. So for example, with The Witcher 3, it doesn't pick up the controls at all. Instead, everything is pushed to the keyboard. And really, this is not the fault of the device, but rather the game, in that it doesn't know what to do when you have both of these plugged in. Now in the IS-based software, there's an option to turn off the onboard controls. This is usually if you're going to be plugging in a Bluetooth controller, but one recommendation I'm sending over to AYANEO is that I hope they have another toggle to be able to turn off the keyboard. And this is something that GPD has been able to work around. For example, they have a controller keyboard toggle on like the GPD Win Mini. And so if anything, I hope this is a software update coming for IS Space to be able to toggle off the keyboard, because as it stands right now, I can't even play Witcher 3 or God of War with the inbuilt controls. Anyway, that's about it when it comes to PC gaming in a nutshell. I found that 15 watt TDP was about the right spot, and there were a few games where I wasn't able to play them because of the way that the software and the keyboard are set up. So now let's finish out our testing with emulation. We're going to start with the very easy stuff. So 8-bit, 16-bit systems, these are going to all play just fine in RetroArch, and you can usually play them at around a 5 watt TDP, so that's going to give you some pretty good battery life. Next up, we have Nintendo 3DS. I found that this one can play at a 3x resolution at about an 8 watt TDP, so that's still pretty good when it comes to battery life. Moving on from there, let's talk about the 6th generation system, so GameCube and PS2. And here I found that the TDP will fluctuate depending on how hard the game is to emulate. So for easier to play games like Paper Mario, yeah, around 9 or 10 watts was fine, but the harder to play games like F-Zero GX did require about a 14 watt TDP. And also bear in mind, this is a 3x resolution upscale, so we are pushing a lot of pixels to the screen. And it's a similar story with PlayStation 2. There are quite a few games like Ratchet & Clank Going Commando that can play at a lower TDP, around 12 watts altogether. However, as you start pushing it up to Beyond Good and Evil, that's going to require about 14 watts. And same thing with God of War 2. This one requires a full 15 watts, so about the max that I was doing in PC gaming. That's what's going to be required to play PS2 at a 3x resolution. Moving on from there, let's try Nintendo Wii U. Now thankfully this one isn't super power hungry, so I found about a 12 watt TDP is is the average for most Wii U games. So Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD plays great at a 1080p resolution with a 12-watt TDP, and same thing with Yoshi's Woolly World, a full frame rate at around that 12 watts. Now Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is always the hardest game to play on the Wii U, but at a 15-watt TDP and a 720p resolution, we get some pretty great performance, around 45 frames per second, so this is definitely a playable and enjoyable experience. Moving on from there, let's talk about PlayStation 3. So at a 15-watt TDP, you can play quite a few games. For example, the lightweight games like Afterburner Climax will play absolutely no problem, but even the more heavyweight 3D-based games like Prince of Persia, this one can get well over 30 frames per second at a 15-watt TDP. Now when it comes to playing the really heavy-hitting games, like Infamous or God of War 3, you gotta really crank up that TDP, but at a 28-watt TDP, those games are also going to be playable, so I would say the full catalog is going to be worth it here on the slide. And then finally, let's do a little bit of Nintendo Switch testing with the Yuzu emulator, and I found that around the 18 to 20-watt TDP seems to work the best. It really is going to depend on the game, but I found that there weren't really any Switch games that couldn't run on this chipset. However, one thing to bear in mind, there were very few games that could run at a 15-watt TDP or lower. This means the device is going to get quite hot in the hands as you're playing it. And not only that, when you're pushing that much power into the device, it is going to take a toll on the battery. So let's go ahead and close out with the battery life testing. Number one, it takes about an hour and a half to charge the device from 0 to 100, and I found that when you put it in sleep mode, it loses about 3% charge overnight. So let's talk about our real-world battery testing at 50% brightness and 50% volume. And we'll start with the right at the lowest TDP and work our way up. And starting with Celeste at a 5-watt TDP that ran at 1080p absolutely no problem, and the battery life on that was pretty good. We got 3 hours and 40 minutes altogether. Next up, I wanted to move into emulation, starting with like Gen 6, and there were many games I could play at around a 9 or 10 watt TDP, and I found that Paper Mario at a 9 watt TDP gave me an average frame rate of 60 frames per second, and I got 2 hours and 27 minutes of battery life. Now if we bump up the wattage just a little bit more to 12 watts, which is a good average when it comes to a Nintendo Wii U, I found this gave me about 2 hours and 14 minutes. And as I mentioned, around the 15 watt TDP is where the device really shines. We get a good balance between battery life as well as performance. And so for the majority of the games that I tested and played with, I found that 15 watts was about right. And here you can see we're getting a little bit under 2 hours, 1 hour and 48 minutes altogether. And so when it comes to expected battery life, this is about where I would think you would be, somewhere around the 2-hour point. So I don't think you'd have a great time playing this device on a long flight unless you had access to a power plug or a battery bank. And then finally on the far left, we have our worst case scenario. That's going to be at a full 28 watt TDP. And here you can see I got just over 1 hour of battery life altogether. And so across the board, I would say the battery life on the AYANEO slide is not great. This is very similar to other x86 handhelds. And so this just kind of comes with the territory when talking about x86 handhelds. They are all going to be very similar to this. In fact, just looking at the numbers here, it's very similar to the ROG Ally. This is about what I would expect on that device as well. So it's not really that the AYANEO slide is particularly bad when it comes to battery life, but it's just something to consider when talking about a handheld PC. Okay, I think it's time to start wrapping up. So let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO slide. And as always, we'll start with what I like. Number one, I can't get over how solid and dense this device feels. It's really premium when you pick it up. And like I mentioned before, it's very similar to feeling the PlayStation Vita 1000. That was also a device that when you first picked it up, it was really impressive, and I'm getting the same vibes here. I also like the screen on this device. I think the color accuracy is very good, and I also love the fact that because it's not built into the device, it runs very cool. The face buttons have also been improved. They're a little bit larger, which makes them more comfortable and just doesn't feel quite as squished as it was before. I also found that the keyboard came in handy when it came to like inputting a PIN or maybe a username and password, but there were a couple negatives related to this as well, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And when it comes to performance, I think it's pretty impressive, especially if you stay around that 15 watt TDP mark. It can definitely go higher, and we'll talk about that also in the what I don't like section, but I did find that even at that 15 watt TDP, I was continuously impressed with how good of performance I could get. And finally, another thing that was just really impressive for me were the ergonomics of this device, even though it is so small. Number one, I think the ergonomic grips on the back make it feel really comfortable, and I also like the fact that the screen will angle up those 30 degrees. It gives me a lot more options when it comes to viewing angles. Now, of course, no device is perfect, and this one has quite a few things that I don't like about it. So let's go over those. Number one, the thing that really just kind of held me back is the fact that it gets pretty warm at 15 watts, and after that, I found it to be uncomfortably hot. So if anything, if you want to push the performance on this device beyond 15 watts, I would say consider maybe playing it in docked mode instead. Because as it stands, I didn't want to play anything above 15 watts when in handheld mode. Another thing that I didn't like about the Windows navigation was the fact that the keyboard kind of felt like a half measure. By that I mean that yes, it's handy not to have an on-screen keyboard all the time, but I also would have really appreciated having some sort of mouse nub as well. As it stands, when it came to setting up Windows, I had to set it up with a Bluetooth mouse just to be able to navigate on that smaller 6-inch screen. And every time I paired the mouse to the device, I kept thinking to myself, well, I might as well pair a keyboard at the same time too. And so while I did like the fact that I could use the keyboard to input a password now and then, I still would have appreciated having some sort of mouse nub just to make Windows navigation that much easier, because the keyboard was really only getting me about halfway there. Another thing worth noting is the analog sticks. I felt like overall the AYANEO Slide has a bunch of great design choices to it, but the fact that they used Nintendo Switch style Joy-Cons for their analog sticks just seems to kind of hold the device back. The analog sticks feel very last generation compared to everything else, which feels a little bit more cutting edge. And unfortunately, the sticks did prevent me from enjoying certain games, particularly first-person shooter games. Another thing worth noting is that the plastic is smudgy again. This has been happening for years at this point, and especially on the dark models. So if this is something that bothers you like it bothers me, I would recommend getting a white model instead. Another issue that popped up for me while doing PC game testing were the inbuilt controls. Sometimes they wouldn't work with certain games. And so I do hope that AYANEO in the future is able to implement some sort of way to toggle off the keyboard so that way the controls are recognized. And finally, the last aspect about the AYANEO Slide that I didn't really like is the fact that the screen doesn't feel super durable when you have it extended. Now, like I mentioned, I think this is a device made for adults, and so as a result, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. But I think it should be noted this is not a device I would consider to be rugged in any way. So when it comes down to it, you're probably wondering what I think about the AYANEO Slide and whether or not I recommend it for others. And like with many of my other device reviews, I'm pretty conflicted about this one. After all, there's a lot of great things going for it. Number one, the ergonomics are excellent. I also think that having a keyboard at the ready is pretty handy as well. In the end, I think that AYANEO did a great job when it comes to innovating within their own handheld PC space. However, with every innovation, there's always a risk that something is not going to pan out. And unfortunately, with the AYANEO Slide, I think there is one too many compromises in the overall experience, and so I do have a hard time recommending a device around $700 or $800 that has this many compromises within. And so I would say if you liked what you saw throughout this whole video and you're okay with the compromises that come with it, then yes, I think the AYANEO Slide is a very good device in that one regard. However, when it comes to my own playstyle, I don't think this is a great fit, and I would rather use something a little bit more on the safe side. And so I don't think the AYANEO Slide will dethrone the Steam Deck or even the ROG Ally for me. Anyway, let me know what you think of the AYANEO Slide in the comments down below. They've got quite a few neat things going with the design, and I'm pretty excited to see what comes out in their next handheld. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.